Good morning, everyone, and welcome to this webinar on interpreting data to improve service delivery. Thank you for making your time to attend this 1-hour webinar. Allow me to introduce myself. I'm Glen, the Senior Research Officer at NADA. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation as the traditional custodians of the land on which NADA office stands. I also like to invite those who are here with us today online to put in the chat box the lands on which they are joining us from. I extend this acknowledgement to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are here with us today online. I also pay respects to the elders, past, present, and future. Joining me today is Sarah Atta, the Clinical Director at NADA, and Professor Peter Kelly, the Associate Dean of Research from the University of Wollongong. The panel, Sarah, Peter, and myself, will be addressing any questions at the end of the webinar. Feel free to add your questions throughout the session. To do this, please use the button at the bottom center of the Zoom window titled Q&A. If you can't see the button, you might need to move your cursor around. So, Pete, let me get this webinar started by asking you to explain what is benchmarking all about. Then I will get Sarah to explain why is it important to NADA and its members.
Thanks, May. Yeah, as May said, my name's Pete. I'm from the University of Wollongong, and I'm really excited. I really enjoy doing these types of presentations around benchmarking. I think it's something that's really important for the sector. You'll hear me probably too many times mention the word quality improvement as part of this presentation. If I was to get at the heart of what I think benchmarking is, I think it's around quality improvement. So it's around thinking about your individual practice as a drug and alcohol worker, or maybe your organization's practice, or maybe even the sector's practice, and trying to make sense of that. So making some comparisons between your organization with another organization, or different parts within your organization, but really with the purpose of improving treatment, improving the experience of treatment for people that are accessing, drug and alcohol services. In this case, here in New South Wales. So hopefully through the presentation, I'll talk you through a few examples of benchmarking. You'll get a nice feel for how it works. But I think it's really about thinking out how can we improve the experience of treatment for, the people that these organisations exist for. I'll throw it over to you, Sarah.
Pete took my question and explained why it's important to benchmark. But just kind of going off the back of that, I also think benchmarking allows a unique experience that the sector hasn't really uptaken yet, on really rich ways to understand the work that they're doing and understand the clients that are presenting and understanding the interventions that we're responding with. And I think people think benchmarking, oh, I'm at a 5, but this person's at a 2, so I'm doing better. It's really not about who's doing better or worse. It's about shared learning across the sector and having a deeper understanding of what's actually going on in your organization or your service or your practice. So NADA and myself are really excited to be a part of that. And we look forward next year to do some more benchmarking in the NGO AOD sector and really working alongside members for those experiences. Over to you, Pete.
Yeah, sure. Let me share my screen and I'll jump into a bit of a presentation. There we go. Yeah, so I should say, I'm presenting here from University of Wollongong, which is on Dharawal country here, and really just wanted to pay my respect to any Aboriginal people that might be dialing in or watching this webinar at some stage. And I guess really talk about the importance of Aboriginal community-controlled organisations to this sector, and you'll see me talk about the Glen a little bit through this presentation. Throughout any of this webinar, I'd really encourage you to ask questions. And so use the chat functions or the Q&A functions or at the bottom of this. Very happy to be interrupted and answer questions along the way. And that same for you, Sarah. Just jump in whenever I say something you disagree with.
Oh, I plan to.
I just wanted to really begin with this caution. And I think I'm talking to funders more than anyone, but I think for organizations that might be a bit nervous about benchmarking as well, as I've already said a few times now, I think benchmarking is around quality improvement. And the risk for funders is when they're starting to compare different organizations and looking at metrics. And hopefully this diagram kind of captures it. I think the downside or the risk of benchmarking, if we're comparing apples with oranges, it just doesn't make sense. So an example would be comparing residential against outpatient treatment. It just doesn't make sense. There's different client population groups coming along, different rates of funding, different levels of training, different amounts of people employed by those organizations, et cetera, et cetera. The list goes on. Likewise, if you think about outpatient counselling, you'll know that there's just a whole range of different outpatient counselling services here in New South Wales who take on vastly different client population groups and work with different substances of use and et cetera, et cetera. So I think we want to be really careful about using any of this to make decisions about funding or to I guess make decisions on where funding may be allocated. I think we want to be thinking about benchmarking of how do we improve the service, how do we improve what's happening. So hopefully that's clear, but no doubt we may want to touch on that as an issue again a bit later on. So if we talk about benchmarking at its core, it's really about comparing one thing with something else. I've put these houses here, they're kind of meant to represent residential treatment, but they could also represent detox, they could represent outpatient counselling, they could represent absolutely anything. At the heart of benchmarking is making a comparison. So in this case, we've got service A versus service B. These services might be in the same organisation, so there might be two different parts of Kadesh rehabilitation services, or they might be comparing different organisations in New South Wales, across Australia, or throughout the world. And I think a good one to think about when we're talking about residential treatment is this idea of average length of stay. If it was outpatient counselling, you'd probably put the average number of sessions or the average amount of time that you'd see someone. And maybe as you're thinking about this presentation, maybe thinking about your own services. What is the average length of stay for your residential program? Or what is the average length of sessions that people are attending? So in terms of benchmarking, if you think about a scorecard, which might be helpful for organizations, putting down where you are and then where the industry standard is or whatever it is that you're comparing at against is the process of benchmarking. And so for this example, you can see that service A, 80 days is the average length of stay, and for service B, the average length of stay is 120 days. Which service is better? Who knows? And that's the intricacy of benchmarking, and that's where the conversation and the discussions happen. You could make an argument for this organization that they're much more efficient, they're getting better client outcomes within 80 days, and the clients over here are staying too long. Likewise, you could make the argument that these clients are leaving too early, and et cetera, et cetera. And that's the nuance of benchmarking, and that's what you miss just with the numbers. It's the thinking through what do these numbers mean, and then using it for quality improvement. And so if you're coming from service A, it would be really critically thinking, are people staying here long enough? Like, should we be doing something to try and help support people stay for a longer period of time? And the only way you would know that is to start looking at some of the outcome measures and start kind of considering what's happening in-house. So I'd really encourage you to move away from just looking at the numbers, but doing that interpretation and thinking about what it actually means, and then what that next step is. So a large proportion of the organizations, I would hazard a guess, who have tuned in for this are using the NADAbase for some of the way that you're collecting client data. If you're not using the NADAbase, you're probably using your own system to collect some outcome measures. And so one of the questions that routinely comes up is how can you use that data for benchmarking? And I'll just try and talk you through an example. So if we're using the NADAbase or we're using any outcome measures, K10s, DASs, days of substance use, et cetera, we want to think about this idea of meaningful improvement. So how many points does someone need to change on these measures for it to actually make a difference in the real world? So if you can hold that in your head, I'll try and talk you through an example, and hopefully that will make sense. So this is a question for people that are tuning in. I'd like you to honestly rate yourself on this scale. So from 0 to 100, where would you rate yourself in terms of your own organizational abilities? So if you're a super organized person, you might put down 0. If you're a very disorganized person, you put yourself down as 100. And if we're in a room right now, I'd get you all to yell out what your scores are. But hopefully you've got a score somewhere on this line. And I should say, I think it's always helpful, the measures that we're getting clients to complete, have a go and do them ourselves. They give the kind of a real insight into how they work and the different things that might go into that interpretation. Because it's me that's just talking, I would put myself pretty close to I'd give myself about a 70. Where would you be, Sarah? Where would you be on that scale?
Oh, I'd be up there with you, about a 70, 75. Easily.
Okay. So if we shift gears again and think we're not in the drug and alcohol treatment game anymore, all of your services are about organization. So we're not trying to treat drug and alcohol problems, we're trying to treat and help people become more organized. That's the focus of our rehab. If on average, when people were coming into our treatment services, they were 50. So on the organizational scale, they're doing much better than me and Sarah. They're at 50 at intake. How many points would you like to see them change for it to actually make a difference? Try and think through this. So if Sarah just said that she was 75, if she went from 75 to 73, do you think any of her family, friends, work colleagues, anyone would notice that she was 2 points more organized? I would argue probably not. And so for this client group, if they move from 50 to 48, although they are improving, it's probably not meaningful. I don't think anyone would notice, and I'm not even sure that that person could notice, and it's probably just measurement error. But if they move 20 points, if they move from 50 to 30, I think we would notice. So I think we would notice our friends or colleagues or clients in this case. And likewise, if Sarah went from 75 down to 55, we would be able to tell. I'm sure she would, be able to brush her hair or get to work on time or organize. I think there'd be some meaningful differences. It's the same concept that we're trying to think about when we talk about the outcome measures that are used in the NADAbase or the outcome measures that you might be using within your organizations. So the K10 is a measure of mental health. And so it really just measures how mentally healthy you've been over the last few weeks. So if on average people were coming into your services on a 30, how many points would you like to see them change for it to actually make a difference, for them to feel better in themselves, so for them to feel a little happier, maybe for them to be able to get to work or engage in activities that they're not engaging? I won't talk you through the maths of this, but there's a number of formulas that we've been able to apply. And what we were able to find is that an 8-point change on the K10, so an 8-point reduction, is reliable and meaningful. It's something that we can actually see a difference in our clients, and we can say, yes, they've improved. So 8-point change. Unfortunately,
Kate, is that over a certain time? Does that come into it? Like, it's 8 points over 90 days, not 8 points over 200 days.
Yeah, it's a good point. So it's 8 points over any time is meaningful. What you would hope to see is if your treatment program went for 240 days, you would imagine that there's a greater proportion of people who would be able to demonstrate that improvement over time. So it's always 8 points, but you would hope that a larger proportion would kind of reach that the longer that the treatment's being provided.
Sure.
One of the downsides of any mental health treatment, and I think we know this in ourselves, that people can get worse. And so often looking at what are the proportion of people that are getting worse is something that we're interested in. And it's the same, it's that they're moving 8 points. Hopefully people are following me, but feel free to put some questions in the chat if you're not. So if we think about what we just went through and we thought about how many points do people need to change for it to be meaningful, one of the questions that I'm hoping you're starting to think about in your own organization is what proportion or what percentage of clients reliably improve at your organization. So we published a paper with NADA, with some other colleagues, looking at the proportion of people who are demonstrating this reliable change. And what you'll see here is after 30 days, about 50% of people in the NADAbase had demonstrated that reliable change. Then it increased to 62% at 60 days, and then about 70% at 90 days. And it was about the same at 120 days. And this is for the residential services. You can also see here the rates of change for the community-based services. And you can see that it's lower. Does this mean that community-based services are less valuable than residential services? Absolutely not. You're comparing apples with oranges. You don't want to be doing that. You want to be comparing like with like. But these are the rates for residential and community. If I was to set you some homework as part of this, which you probably won't do because no one does their homework, but if you were to do some homework, it'd be try and work this out for your own service. Do you have the same rates of change for, an average that's happening across the NADAbase? Are yours a little bit lower? And is there something you might be, wanting to do or change as part of your practice to get it up to this benchmark? And are yours slightly higher, or are yours a lot higher? And then what does that say about your organization? What sort of conversations might you want to have? So it's an example of how you could use the NADAbase. These are the number of points that people need to change across the three measures within the NADAbase. I won't get into kind of the difference between the sort of different mathematical formulas you can use to work out how many points people need to change. I'd maybe stick to this middle one here, the reliable change, and think about 8 points for the K10, about 5 points for the SDS, substance dependent scale, and about 8 points for quality of life. So we've published a paper that's very happy to send it around, and I'll send them through to Alice, and maybe she could send through both of these papers to everyone that's registered for this. So this paper describes what we were just talking about. Just lastly, I wanted to highlight the Glen. So the Glen is an Aboriginal community-controlled organisation, and kind of a number of years ago now, they reached out and wanted to do some benchmarking around their client outcomes. They were really using the NADAbase pretty regularly. They're interested to know how they compared to the sector more broadly. I think one of the things they were particularly interested in, I'm sure they could do a better job of describing this, but I think it was that idea that Aboriginal community-controlled organisations often felt like they needed to justify their existence and why it is that they were important and needed. And the Glen were keen to look at their rates of change and how that compared to the sector more broadly, and to mainstream services that were also working with Aboriginal people. This is a really nice example of making those comparisons. What was good for the Glen were that their outcomes were either comparable to mainstream drug and alcohol services, or they were getting better outcomes than the mainstream drug and alcohol services on some of their items. Likewise, the length of stay and the engagement of Aboriginal people was much higher at the Glen compared to other mainstream services. So the paper is a nice feel-good description of what happened for the Glen, and helps to provide some scientific evidence behind what it is that happened. If it was the other way around, if it turned out that they weren't performing as well as they wanted, that was an opportunity for the Glen to think about, okay, how can we do this better? And what was really refreshing working with Joe and the team as we were doing this, I think that was really sincerely where they were coming from. It was like, we just want to know how we're doing. And if we're doing well, great, let's publicize that. If we're not doing well, we don't necessarily need to publicize it, but we need to fix it and get it right. So we are, serving our community as well as we can. So I'll just leave that kind of as the final thought. I don't think benchmarking needs to be something that you're shouting to the world and that you're demonstrating to everyone. It's a bit looking at yourself in the mirror naked. Like, I don't think you need to put that on the internet and show the world, but looking at that and thinking, okay, where can I make some improvements, or what are we maybe not doing so well, and then working at that. And then once you've improved, if you address that, maybe you do want to shout that to the world or put it on the internet. I'll leave it there, Sarah. I might just throw it back to you. I'm not sure if any questions have come through or if you've got any comments around any of that.
We don't have any questions at the moment, but I do want to kind of pull out what you said, that there's different iterations of benchmarking. There's benchmarking like for like, and there's kind of benchmarking against sector standards. And there's different ways to do these different types of activities. And like you just said, it can totally be a private, internal, organizational driven thing. I also think if you do have good results or you don't, and that triggers something for you to respond in a certain way where you do have quality improvement, that's something also the sector needs to hear and experience, and kind of myth bust that benchmarking is this thing that's going to pop out and give you a bad reputation. I think it's a really robust way to engage with data and the sector about how to do quality improvement. I wonder if everybody thinks that we think benchmarking is about quality improvement yet, Pete.
Well, and like just to add to what you're saying, that's often how we get grant funding. So there are problems arisen, like something's not happening as well as it could be, and then taking that to government and saying, this is an issue. We're thinking this is a way that we can address it. Can you get it funded? And so rather than it being something you're sort of hiding from, often it's an opportunity to get increased funding or get more evaluation or whatever it is to address it.
Yeah, and I think it's also about understanding your data. So if I'm benchmarked as low or I look less efficient, it might be that my client profile is far more severe. So those little gains actually take just as much resources as this other organization that isn't working with such a complex profile. So and then you can go to government and say, we need a bit more resources on board because this is why our outcomes look like this, because these are the people that are presenting to us. So, and I really like what you said before about it launching us into conversations and discussions and reflective practice, and really trying to ask the questions. And it is about analyzing, but it's about what do we do now and how do we move forward? And I feel really excited to kind of do more of that stuff. I know Pete and I will be speaking on Valentine's Day, actually, everybody, on ways that the University of Wollongong and NADA can really support members and bring them along on the journey from the beginning, which Pete and I are definitely passionate about.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Can I ask you a question, Pete?
Go for it.
What do you think would be kind of the different experiences from a larger organization perspective to maybe a smaller NGO that has maybe 20 FTE and then the large ones that range up to 100 FTE? And what would be the differences like on the ground that members would want to consider?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think for the larger, the really large organizations, I think often they've got sort of good infrastructure in place, and they're collecting this type of information, and potentially some of the benchmarking is already happening, but maybe happening at a sort of a very high sort of senior level. So for those types of organizations, I guess I would be encouraging them to think about how, like, the workforce, the drug and alcohol workers, the team leaders, the managers, whoever who are on the ground, who are supporting activities, that they can be involved in those processes, because I think it's often the people that are delivering the programs or involved in that grassroots, they're the ones that kind of know what's happening and know where there are opportunities to think about improvements in practice. So I think particularly for the larger organizations, just thinking about that engagement at a lower level, I think is really important. I think for the smaller organizations, and maybe my presentation didn't necessarily help this, I think sometimes it might feel a little overwhelming or a little too confusing, or a little like, how do I get this started? So we'll send you through the papers, and you'll see that there's sort of some maths in there, and there's some formulas. And I guess the message I'll be trying to pass on to people is, don't let that put you off. It's a really simple idea of just comparing this with this. Some of the mechanics underneath it, I think NADA, and I'd be very happy to help any organizations to problem solve, or think through how you might be able to do this. So yeah, I think for smaller organizations, or if you haven't started, don't be put off with the mechanics of it. I think that's something that's very achievable with, probably just, talking to NADA, talking to myself, and just starting to get those processes happening. While I'm on a roll, I just wanted to add one more thing. I've been lucky enough that I get to go around and visit different drug and alcohol services, and often it's because we've run a study, and we've gone back and tried to provide some of the feedback from those studies to organizations. Often on our first slide, we'll just have like gender, like, this proportion of men, this proportion of women, or average age, or whatever. And often for the workforce, that's the first time that they're seeing that type of information. And so we might spend 10, 15 minutes just talking about the age breakdown of their service. I think that type of information, I think you want to be engaging the workforce in really regular conversations all the way through. I think often they get stuck in management reports that go off somewhere, but don't necessarily get discussed at the grassroots. But I think that's where the quality improvement happens, where you engage people around, this is what's going on. Is this good? Is this bad? How do we improve it? Et cetera, et cetera. I'll stop talking and pass it back to you, Sarah.
But I also think it's a really good point, because when you get down to the grassroots, or the people that are actually collecting the data or having that experience, if you can connect them to the meaning of the data, often your data quality is better, because it's more important now to be able to, do the treatment outcome data, every 4 weeks or 3 months, whatever you choose as an organization. And it becomes more of a priority, because they can see the outputs of it. It doesn't just kind of go off into the abyss. So I really echo what Pete's saying about, making that an organizational wide response, and kind of part of standard practice. Like when you go to your monthly staff meetings, we all look at, the data, or the treatment outcome data, or some reports that you can pull down from NADAbase, or your own bespoke systems. Which also leads us into the NADAbase snapshot, which I don't know if a lot of people know about, but once a year, it nearly took May down. May's done the one for this last financial year, which will be released in the next few weeks. But it does some of that benchmarking work for you already. So it benchmarks the sector. It does stratify the data in different ways, so it can be more like for like. It's not perfect, but it's a big piece of work that NADA does every year. And I think the more that benchmarking becomes a part of, business as usual, that document is really something, especially as a smaller organization that maybe doesn't have the infrastructure, that you can immediately look to. And equally happy for you to reach out to NADA and Pete to talk about, well, this is the benchmark from the sector. How do I look at my stuff? And can you kind of talk us through that? And I think the other opportunity, for smaller organizations is to be able to lean on each other and lean on the sector, and find like for like. And it might be easier, and it doesn't just kind of sit with you as an internal organization thing, and you're trying to find money for it. And really work alongside people and in partnership with different unis across the state, I think is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a really nice resource, those snapshots. If you've got the time and you could download them, you might just want to go through and just highlight some of the stuff in there. And I think there'll be figures, or there'll be rates of change, or what that you'll look at and be like, oh, I wonder how my service applies to that. What proportion of people accessing my service have English as a second language, or what's my gender ratio, or whatever it is. Those reports will give you sort of what you can compare to. And so, as Sarah was saying, they've been done every year, I think, for 3 or 4 years now. And May's just finished off the draft of the very latest one, and that'll get released in the next couple of weeks as well. So they're good things to compare against. So you can obviously compare against other organizations. You can compare against other services in your organization, but you can also compare to what's happening across the sector. you may even want to use some of that information for some of your own, funding reports or funding submissions that you're putting in. It gives you a level of, we're seeing equivalent to what's happening across the broader sector, or whatever the argument is that you're trying to make.
And equally, when you all leave this webinar and bombard the NADA website to see the NADA snapshots, which is where they are, if you have any feedback, like you think we're really missing this part of the data that would be really helpful, or you're looking for this and it wasn't there, or this was really helpful, maybe you could do a bit more of that work. Like, we're very open to doing it in different ways and making sure that that snapshot is actually useful in real time for everyone, and not just kind of Pete and May thinking, oh, that's probably helpful. So totally open to any feedback and being a part of those conversations. And we have our first question, Pete. I hope you're ready.
I'm ready. I'm good to go. Thanks, Jesse. Let me shoot the question. So a lot of these measures have norm thresholds, e.g. mild, moderate, severe. When looking at changes in scores, should we be looking at whether people move across these thresholds or just numeric changes? Similarly, a difference between 90 and 70 can be clinically far more significant than 50 to 30. Any thoughts on this? Great questions. And I guess you're getting into the real detail of this. I haven't really talked about a lot of the detail in this, and I think these are the types of questions that start coming up once your head's in the data and once your head's kind of around it. So in answer to your question, yes, I think moving across thresholds is an important thing, and seeing if people are moving from severe to moderate, I think is important. I'm just making these categories up, but for example, if severe was above 30 and moderate was below 30, moving from 31 to 29 isn't probably that meaningful, because they're still just moving 2 points. And if you were to measure it the next day, they'd probably back up those 2 points. But if they were moving from those categories and they were moving 8 points or whatever it is, I think that's more meaningful. But the idea of moving from sort of clinical or more severe to less severe, I think, is a really important thing to think about. And then your point around moving from 90 to 70 might be better than 50 to 30. Absolutely. So if someone was at 90, if that was possible on the K10, they're probably highly suicidal, or they're at least, you'd be concerned about suicidality, you'd be concerned about safety. Whereas at the lower numbers, probably not. You're more worried about, did they get to work on time, et cetera, et cetera. And so there's slightly different questions. And so I think that's what you're trying to think through in the benchmarking. What is it that I'm particularly interested in? And if you're particularly interested in the most severe group of people that are coming to your service, then that's what you might be benchmarking. What happens with these people who are at the extreme end? Are we able to get their, reductions down? Or, for people at the more moderate end, are we able to have an impact? They're kind of different questions. I hope did that make sense to you, Sarah?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think it's a good way to understand it. And especially that point about, if severe is 30 over and moderate's under 30, but you're only moving 2 points, that's really something to consider, and kind of the limitations in some of the data and outcome measures that can tip us into those conversations organically. And again, like you said, Pete, it's about us being reflective on that and jumping into those conversations and really being clear on what questions are we trying to answer and how.
Yeah. And just to, I guess, go back to that idea of this is all too complicated. This conversation potentially feels too complicated if you haven't started it. But once you've started this journey and you start doing it, then these things just sort of naturally come up, and it's relatively straightforward. There's another question from Holly. So benchmarking involves, to a degree, a consistent use of the same measures to build a reliable profile of your client population. Our service often comes up against funders who want to use their own preferred measures. Any recommendations on how we encourage funders to come on board with a service's outcome measure preferences? This is a really tricky one. It's easiest to compare like with like, and so if you've always been using K10s and you want to compare against the industry, standard, which is K10. You kind of want to keep using K10s. But it's problematic when funders are trying to put in other measures, which maybe they're wanting to benchmark on their own outside of that. I guess the short answer from my perspective, and I'll definitely give Sarah a chance to answer this one, is try and stick with using consistent measures over a period of time. You get a real strength in the amount of data that you have and the consistency with how you've been able to do it over a period of time. Most of the measures measure the same thing. They're just slightly different versions. It's like whatever the difference between McDonald's and Hungry Jack's or KFC or whatever, another chicken like Red Rooster. They're very similar. There's not a lot of difference. It just sort of comes down to personal preference. And so hopefully in a lot of situations, you might be able to argue the case that they're actually measuring the same things. This often comes up with the ATOP and the NADAbase, and on the NADA website, there's a comparison between the ATOP and the NADAbase items. And so you might be able to use those types of documents to support what's happening. Sarah, did you probably answer a more sensible way than me?
No, I do think it's tricky because the clinician part of me and kind of the NGO part of me wants to say, oh, well, I know my organization the best, and I know that these outcome measures are the best because I've done this process, and this is what I think is best to support the people that are accessing this service. I also am aware that the risk that Pete just spoke about, that if everyone's using a different tool, then the opportunity to benchmark or understand the sector in the same conversation becomes difficult. So I think it's really tricky. And I think if we think as a sector that the outcome measures need updating or different, I think it's a real sector-wide conversation. And I would really encourage Holly for you to come and speak to NADA, and we're happy to have those conversations and also kind of acknowledge we have a lot of historical data that's really rich. So I think there's pros and cons to it, and it's really tricky.
Yeah.
Did that answer your question, Holly? Sorry, Pete.
No, yeah. We'll see if Holly types it in. I was just gonna just change gears just slightly. Often when we talk about benchmarking, we talk about your organization and how's your organization compared to something else. I think as a clinician, I think what interests me the most is the work that I do effective? Like, is the work in my counseling room or in my whatever it might be, how does that compare? And so we often talk about organizations, but there's lots of examples and lots of papers where people have looked at their own practice and looked at their own rates of change and looked at the client groups that they're seeing, just to really think about their own clinical skills. And so I just wanted to throw that out there, that's a possibility, and there's some good papers that demonstrate that.
Yep. And I think I know funders, there's, maybe saying you have to use the ATOP or the NADAcoms, but it also doesn't stop you from doing your own internal stuff as well. And in addition to, which I totally appreciate, that we all don't have time for that. But if it's something that you really think the measures aren't picking up on, and it's something that's really impacting clinical work or client experience, I definitely would encourage you to start trying to think about data collection that can help explain what that concern is, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Oh, May, fire it in.
Okay. I'm just curious, like after this, once this webinar ends, so what happened next? How do I start? And it's great to see that Pete talks about the Glen, but what about smaller organizations who have only like just one or two full-time AOD worker? How do I start? Where do I begin with? I feel overwhelmed. God, it sounds like I need a therapy.
You want to take a crack at that first, Sarah, and then I'll go?
Yeah, I think it's kind of what we've been talking about, is looking to NADA for some of that stuff, and the NADA snapshot really being able to support that in real time if it's accessible right now, and leading on systems that are already there and looking what data you already have kind of in flow. So instead of creating additional work, and it's not like a forward-facing plan, it's more about you looking back at the data. And I think those experiences are really readily available like I said before, too, really leaning on the sector or other like for like services, particularly if you're a small service, you can work with another small service, and that might be helpful. And for the larger organizations, it might not be that you're going outward yet. It might be that you're comparing two of your residential services, and one's in rural New South Wales and one's in metropolitan, and kind of understanding those differences and being in those conversations. So I think for benchmarking specifically, there's opportunity across the sector to engage in it, and how you engage in it might just be a little bit different. And Nada and Pete are happy to be in those conversations with anybody that wants to have a chat. I don't know what I've just signed us up for, Pete. We might have a lot of people wanting the conversations, but it's something that we're very passionate about.
It's funny you should say that, because I've given a few of these presentations over time, really, sort of since NADAbase has happened. And there's really not that many services that have kind of reached out at different points to do it. They're often really well attended, but I think that there's just that barrier of how do you do it and finding time and et cetera, et cetera. Really sincerely, I'd be happy to meet with any services and just talk it through with them and see what they've got and offer some suggestions. And I couldn't necessarily do it all for everyone, but would be very happy to help kind of progress it along. Would be very happy, and sometimes that would be good, having multiple services in those conversations, but likewise you may not be there where you want to talk to other or show other services, and yeah, would be very happy to talk individually. And I think NADA as well, something the sector might want to consider, and it's really not my place to be suggesting this, but like a community of practice around benchmarking. If there were like-minded sort of similar organizations who are kind of struggling or starting, a community of practice around something like this might be helpful. And that doesn't mean you need to show anyone what data you've got or anything, but just talking about the processes and the challenges, and how you understand some of this may be helpful for the sector if there was an interest.
Definitely. A community of practice always sounds great, doesn't it? It's often the answer to the problems in the sector. Also, I wanted to flag and pump the NDRAG, which is a horrible name, and I'm going to work on that. But it's the NADA Data Research Advisory Group, and it meets quarterly. And if you ever wanted to talk about benchmarking or data or kind of system-driven stuff like that, you can always approach NADA, and we can put you in touch with somebody from the NDRAG or from NADA or from Pete. And maybe from there, with any NDRAG members on here right now, we can talk about what a community of practice would be like, and how that can really support people in real time, and kind of the safe place to come and access the information and the other experiences from other people that may have been doing it and are really happy to share. And I also think, like, the only thing that reduces fear is repetition. So the more that we do this and the more that we're in this space, I think just nothing but value adding for the sector. So I'm very excited.
Yeah.
Holly, I note your response, and please reach out. And thank you for the compliment. Holly's loving the presentation.
Thanks, Holly. We do appreciate it. Are there any other questions that people would like answered?
Do you have anything else you want to add, Pete, or any last words?
If I was to give some last words, it would be, just trying to think of them. I think it would definitely be around, which we haven't mentioned, the quality of the data that's being collected and how regularly you're collecting data improves your chances of benchmarking. And so if it is using things like the NADAbase, really routinely collecting data across your organization is what's going to improve that. I think the other point, which you've heard me sort of say a bunch of times, I don't think that this is that complicated. I think there might be like a slight learning hurdle that I think we can help you get over. And then I think you'll be able to do it and just engage in those activities. And then the last point, which you've heard us say 20 times now, but around quality improvement. Like, none of this is around the numbers. It's around how do we all do a better job in the services and the organizations to help improve outcomes. So I think they'd be my takeaway messages. Do you want me to have a go at answering this question? Anonymous attendee, how do we choose which data to benchmark to start with? That's a really good question, and is probably one of the trickiest things. this might sound a little corny, but I'd maybe just brainstorm it within your organization, or brainstorm it with NADA and us, but maybe just brainstorm it around the table at your morning meeting or your staff meeting. What are you interested in? What do you care about within your service? What do you think's important? Is it length of stay? Is it, how many, female clients we're getting along? Is it, are this, do young people drop out of our treatment, more than older people? Or just thinking through, okay, what is it that we're interested in? What's the purpose of our service? And just making a list of that. And then I think you'll start seeing what measures you could start using, or where that data might come from. Or if you're completely not measuring that, you might want to think about, if it's around PTSD and you've got no measure of PTSD, then it's like, okay, maybe we need to start measuring this, so then we can make some comparisons to something. But I think it always comes back to what's the purpose of your organization, like why you exist, what's kind of your bread and butter, and how do we start comparing if we're, identifying where we can improve in that.
And I also think, like, if you're just starting on this, I would look at systems that are already in place, like some data that you already have historically have, so you can immediately kind of start engaging in the benchmarking. If it's just with your data for the last financial year and the NADA snapshot, because that will help support those conversations that Pete was talking about, like the why and how are we trying to improve here. So I think kind of we don't want to make it resource intensive, and there's a lot of data already out there, and I think anywhere you start will be good.
Yeah, agreed. What were your takeaways, Sarah?
Well, I definitely just want to pump the quality improvement initiative and say that I really do agree with that. I also have heard a little bit in the sector that, being worried about funders, maybe kind of looking at the NGOs through that type of lens, or that impacting funding, or might change the conversations. And I've certainly been in conversations with the ministry, and this is something that they, from what I understand, would really support. They think it's a really good way to use data. And I think in a lot of ways, the NGO sector can kind of lead the field in this, and kind of talk to the ministry about, we've done this is how it's helped, and this is what we're doing with it, and this is kind of our plan forward. And NGOs are always, usually innovative and in front, and I just think it's another opportunity for us. And there's nowhere in the sector where I can see a risk to any organization to participate in this. And again, just want to let you know that me, Pete, and May are really happy to talk to anybody that wants to be involved in this, and just repump that. Those are my final words. May, you got anything?
Not really, because I felt that I'm standing in the presence of giants in the field of benchmarking, to be honest. So
we paid May to say that.
Yes. I think Pete and Sarah has covered most of it, but again, we may never know, because we are only standing on one side of the fence. It will be interesting to find out what do members actually feel or think when they carry this benchmarking, or they incorporate benchmarking into their everyday practice. So the questions will come then.
Yeah, couldn't agree more.
Yeah. And to be honest, I've while this thing is going on live, I already received an email from one of the members saying that, could we meet up to talk about this benchmarking as they attend this webinar. So it's great that this webinar sparks interest in members.
That's great. That's good to hear.
Yeah,
that's good to hear.
Well, there's no more questions, so we might leave it here with everybody. You get 9 minutes back in your diary. It's a little gift from NADA and the University of Wollongong to you all. And
so
thanks so much for coming. Sorry, May.
Okay. I was doing the wrapping up bit, but I'm happy for you to
wrap up.
Okay.
I was just saying thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. We are coming to an end of the webinar. But I hope this will be the beginning of the benchmarking era for NADA and its members. I would like to thank Professor Peter Kelly and Sarah Etter for their time to talk about benchmarking in the AOD sector and what it means to all services, big and small. So this webinar will be made available online with other resources put together soon. For those who want to take up Pete and Sarah's offers to get in touch, you can contact either Sarah and Pete with their details made available later. With that, I end the webinar and have a good week, everyone. Happy Wednesday. And this may be an early thing, but as we wrap things up in 2022, I wish you and your loved ones a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays.
Thanks, May. Thanks, Sarah.
Nice.
Okay.
Pete.
Thank you,
Thanks, everyone.
Pete.